sand is the thing. And around this the individual grain of sand is the core of the thing, which is itself always already possible. And you can reduce it to its most abstract sense. I won't do it now because it's overwhelming. Especially if, philosophy seems to go hand in hand with altered states of mind, right? Me personally, I don't have to alter my state of mind because my mind is already altered, and philosophy keeps me in that altered state. But I can't even imagine what it must be like to think of that possibility, right? That the existence of the core of a thing, independent to any individual thing. It's almost impossible to do it without really understanding, I would argue, Leibniz, and one of these days I'll do justice to Leibniz and I'll do the monadology, maybe, because it was one of my favorite texts and I studied under a pretty good Leibnizian scholar. So the idea is, it's very difficult to conceptualize. It's very difficult to conceptualize. Any visual representation of this generalizes, but there's no other way to do it, right? So we have to stay on that surface level, which is properties arrange themselves around a thing. The core of the thing is always already possible. Okay, so let's do a deconstruction of this then. All right, so the deconstruction of this concept at the bottom of page 4, number 1. Things effectively organize themselves, things effectively organize properties around the subject, right? And I gave you the technical concept there, right? To hypokamion, I think I pronounced that right. Things effectively organize themselves around the subject, right? The subject, then, individual, the thing, I don't want to jump ahead, is sort of the attractive, if you will. It's the magnetism. It's the possibility that this particular existence can be, right? There's a whole discourse on the to be, right? And I think that's very clear, right? It's the possibility that this thing can be, and thus, insofar as the thing can be, it's always, if you will, and I love this idea, right? It's always, and this is metaphorical, it's always broadcasting, if you will, right? Transmitting its possibility to individuals who are enlightened, right? So you think about the word enlightenment, right? And I'm not going to go off into the deep end. It gets really esoteric at this level. Some of this stuff you'll have to dig on your own. Philosophy is a gateway drug to real hardcore thinking. All of this is just to get your palate wet so that you do some individual thinking of your own, and then you get to see the blackness and the light. But in a sense, they're, in a very real sense, the existence that is itself possible, but not yet actual, right? Say that again. The existence that is possible, but not yet actual, is always already given. It's always already there. Its possibility is there. It requires us. It requires the scientist, the logician, the mathematician, the poet, the novelist. It requires us, the avant-garde, which we'll see much later. It requires us to be able to see its existence as possible and begin the work, right? The work of creating art. For me, as I said much earlier in the video series, this is my art. This is what it would be unfortunate to think that I'm not an artist. I don't do art in the same way that others do, but this is art. This really is. I try to keep it at that level, right? And I mean in a very dense sense, and we'll talk about what that really means, right? It's a very high context lecture series. I do want you to understand things, and I want it to be sort of matter of fact and plain, very low context. But in a real sense, this lecture is specifically designed to simultaneously facilitate the variety of my viewers. Some viewers will understand what I'm saying with reference to Leibniz's monadology because you recognize the relationship between Leibniz's conception of the monad and Heidegger's conception of, I don't want to use the technical terms, but this sort of always already, the core of a thing, and that will make sense for you, and that will direct you in a certain path. People who don't have that understanding, if this is your first introduction to philosophy, then you have, my presentation is, and my discussion on the sandcastle will help make sense of this. The lecture then simultaneously facilitates a very, very high context, which is art, right? So this is, I try to facilitate a very high context lecture, and it's not easy to conceptualize. It's not easy to present or to organize as a lecture. But that the idea is, insofar as we're deconstructing this notion, right? Insofar as we're trying to deconstruct and make sense of exactly what this is, again, he says it's organized around the individual, right? Or it's organized around the individual thing. So, in constant coexistence with its condition for existence, right? In constant coexistence, that's actually me, but in constant coexistence with its condition for existence. So, I want to read top of page 5. If you look at the bottom, there's a huge footnote there. I want to take this to another level, because this is, it is profoundly deep, right? And once I finally get into I'm doing my epistemology lecture series now. I think I'm 4 or 5 hours in, so it's starting to get a little bigger. I'm getting happy about that. I really don't get comfortable with my lecture series until I hit about 10 to 12 hours. Once I hit 10 to 12 hours, it's official. Until it's 10 to 12 hours, it's sort of not too official. So I'll be happy once I get to that point. But once I actually start my metaphysics lecture series, either later this year or next year, with the epistemology lecture series being several hours dense, and then metaphysics lecture series being also several hours dense, I think it'll be a huge contribution, an enormous contribution to the discipline that I love so much. Let's read this quote at the bottom of page 5. Quote, and this I've given citation to where it comes from. Aristotle thus interprets, let me cap my pen, my marker. Aristotle thus interprets essence as the principle or structure of the concrete thing. Essence is the structure of a thing. For Aristotle, right? For Aristotle, essence is the structure, the substrate of a thing. In contrast to a physicalistic or materialistic understanding of reality. As we all know, Aristotle rejected Plato's notion of transcendent form. And I've discussed this already in my Aristotle discourse on actuality and potentiality. And I should hyperlink to this as well. And I wish you could see the structure, because it's so beautiful. But I'm going to try and provide a link to my Aristotle lecture series here as well. Link to Aristotle. Because we talk about which came first, the acorn or the oak tree, blah, blah, blah. You go through, you do your discourse. What's important here is that this really applies to our discourse on aesthetics, right? In terms of aesthetics, there is a possibility, and that possibility needs to be actualized. Aristotle talks about, in depth, about the relationship between the possible and the actual, and this is where we are now, right? This is a citation from the journal article that I'm fleshing out now. So, as we all know, Aristotle rejected Plato's notion of transcendent form. I've done a discourse on that. I can't get into it now. So watch the video, which I'll hyperlink to get a better understanding of what that means. But in so doing, he did not reject the idea of the immaterial nature of the immanent form within the particular. Okay, what does that really mean? And, I do have to do a bit of overlap. The example that I gave was the idea of a chair. The idea of a chair, you have to think before the first chair ever was made, and this, and again, another gross example, but nonetheless we need it in order to conceptualize this. Before the existence of the first chair, some artists had to conceive of the chair. The possibility for the chair was always already there. The artist had to construct her understanding of what this thing looked like, should be, could be, and used her effort, her work, to create the chair, to bring the chair into